Chapter 2: The Anschluss. In spite of the impact of the worldwide depression, which had pushed Austria to the financial brink in 1931, the Bettelheims led the life of a typical upper-middle-class Viennese couple. They immersed themselves in the rich culture that burgeoned along the Ringstrasse. Performances of Reagan at the Burg Theater, of Die Sau by Flotti at the Staatsoper, of Don Juan at the Musikverein. Both Bruno and Gina loved art and regularly attended new gallery shows and exhibits at the Vastkunsthistorisches Museum or at the Secession Pavilion. Joseph Maria Ulbricht's lavishly oriental domed Shrine du Schiel, climbed, and the movement's other breakaway modernists. Occasionally, on a weekend evening, the couple invited friends in, and Hedwig would set out an informal but elegant supper, concluding with the desserts that Bruno so loved, especially the golden, foamy baked egg soufflé called Salzburger Knockerl. When not socializing at home, they gathered at the Herrenhof and other coffee houses, often with Hans Willig and Walter Neurath, Bruno's classmates from the Realschule, and Fritz Redl, the friend from his aborted university. This comfortable and cultured existence, Bettelheim felt doubly the outsider. He was a Jew, an ugly one, in his view, who daily had to face a sneer of Austria's Catholic majority, and also a merchant with no standing in the remarkable Jewish intellectual elite that managed to thrive in Vienna's oppressive anti-Semitism and that gave the city so much of its luster during the years when Bruno came of age. He sat at the Herrenhof and read the Neue Freie Press, but he was not a Kaffeehaus Literat. Did not travel with the influential Jewish writers of that liberal publication or with the literary crowd that gathered around Karl Kraus's satirical journal, Die Fackel. He sat in concert and theater audiences, but that is as close as he came to the realms of Robert Musil or Max Reinhardt, Arnold Schoenberg or Richard Strauss. Most of the time he could only peer through the glass at the heady world of Sigmund Freud and his disciples, a world in which Gina participated far more than he did. He especially envied Fritz Redl, only a year his senior, who had gotten his degree in 1925, the year before Anton Bettelheim's death thrust the lumber business onto his reluctant son. Redl's training analyst was Richard Sterba at the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute. Anna Freud supervised him in psychoanalytic counseling. Bruno's cousin, Edith Buxbaum, also only a year older, was making her way as well, a graduate of the university and training to be an analyst, and active in socialist politics. But without a diploma, even a routine career in law or medicine was out of Bettelheim's reach, at a time when both professions remained open to a man of his intelligence. As late as 1936, 62% of the lawyers and 47% of the doctors in Vienna were Jewish. Superscript 1: Adolf Hitler was 17 when he first arrived in Vienna in 1907. While Bruno was just beginning to play beneath the dining room table. The would-be artist from Linz was full of optimism about what moving to the pulsing imperial city would mean for his future. But his drawing was found wanting, and his efforts to become a student at the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts were twice rejected. In Mein Kampf, he wrote that the next years were the saddest of his life. He lived only a short tram ride away from the Bettelheim family's apartment at Neubaugasse 66, first in a furnished room in the Simon Denk Gasse, near the Franz Josef Bahnhof. Then in a series of flafhouses or the rundown men's hostel at Meldenstrasse 27, a few blocks from the Danube. Between meals at soup kitchens, he roamed the city in a shabby black overcoat draped to his ankles, working occasionally as a construction laborer or picking up odd jobs or hauling luggage at the West Bahnhof. Himself in the anti-Semitic literature widely available in Vienna, tracts that kindled his belief in a great Aryan master race. In 1913, the year before Bruno entered the Realschule, the bookish vagrant Cube left inhospitable Vienna for Germany. 2 decades later, on January 28, 1933, Nazi stormtroopers jackbooted through Berlin shouting Sieg Heil, as Hitler declared himself chancellor of what he promised would be a 1,000-year Reich. That Austria would be part of it, Hitler had no doubt. It was just a matter of when, and in March 1933, the Austrians obliged him by starting down the road to fascism on their own. The country had struggled with the idea of democratic government since the war's end in 1918, with no party ever gaining the upper hand for long. The workers gave the Social Democrats a solid majority in Red Vienna, where about a third of the Austrian people lived. The Christian Socialists ruled among the Catholic peasants and conservative classes in the provinces. The Pan-German Nationalists drew some supporters from both of these camps, and many more from the urban middle class. All these parties made democratic noises from time to time, but they never abandoned preparations for the possibility of civil war. The Social Democrats Schatzbund and the Christian Socialists Heimwehren collided regularly throughout the 1920s, and by the early 1930s. With the economy in tatters from the failure of the Kreditanstalt, Austria's most important bank, and Nazism on the rise in Germany, both the Austrian nationalists and the Social Democrats saw a chance to take control of the parliament by demanding a general election. Both failed, but only by one vote, which is all the majority that Engelbert Dollfuss could muster when he formed the Christian Socialist government in May 1932. 10 months later, the 39-year-old federal chancellor, known as Mila Metternich for his fierce political ambition and diminutive stature, solved this awkward problem by suspending parliament and initiating rule by decree. The First Republic had lasted 15 years. For Bruno Bettelheim and the rest of Vienna's Jews, the slide toward catastrophe had begun. Though Dollfuss opposed annexation with Germany and had no sympathy for the Austrian Nazis, they soon began to thrive in the totalitarian atmosphere he created. He released tear gas in department stores to frighten off shoppers, smeared households with pro-Hitler graffiti, set off firecrackers and petards in many places to cause panic, and eventually started outright bombings. In October 1933, Dollfuss was grazed by a single shot fired by a Czech Nazi named Dertel. 4 months later, civil Democrats rank and file, long impatient cautious, started fighting on their own. Dollfuss had dissolved the left-wing militias, but some 20,000 underground members rallied to the cause around the country. Ultimately, almost 1,000 people died in the outbreak, many of them around the Karl-Marx-Hof. The massive red brick complex of some 1,600 apartments opened in 1930 by the Social Democratic city government for working-class families. Holed up in these fortress-like superblocks, less than 5 miles from the leafy quiet of Jean and Bruno's suburban neighborhood, defenders held out for 4 days before Dollfuss's forces, using artillery, overcame their resistance. The power of Red Vienna was broken, and the new mayor of the capital, a Christian socialist politician named Richard Schmitz, took over the social democratic institutions that had provided a considerable measure of democracy. Instead of taking on the illegal Nazi networks, Austro-fascism had crushed the sole force that might have offered serious resistance to Hitler. On July 25, 1934, a force of 154 Nazis overwhelmed government headquarters in the Ballhausplatz and shot Dollfuss in the neck and shoulder. He was placed on a couch in his office, where he bled to death, his murderers refusing him either a doctor or a priest. News of the assassination exhilarated Hitler, who received it in Bayreuth, where he was attending a performance of Das Rheingold at the annual Wagner Festival. In his books and other writing, Bettelheim did not relate in any detail how he and his family, or his friends, reacted to these developments, how they coped on a daily basis with the politics of thuggery and gunfire that had begun to subvert the once serene world of cafes and culture they inhabited. Gina told me that her husband toyed with the idea of leaving, and at one point urged her to ask her father's wealthy brother, Moritz Altstadt, to give them the money to emigrate to the United States. On one of their Sunday visits to his villa outside Vienna, she did so, but Uncle Moritz turned her down. It is not clear, however, that they would have packed up even if he had provided the cash. Bruno did not need anyone else's money to leave Austria. He had more than sufficient funds to get himself and Gina across the Atlantic had they really wanted to go. Bettelheim and Schnitzer continued to provide a good income, and, despite the looming political crisis, in early 1937 the partners began to expand, turning out finished products like paneling and furniture as well as the raw lumber that they had sold for years. Like hundreds of thousands of European Jews who contemplated leaving their threatened homelands, Bettelheim hesitated what he knew, because German was his language and culture seemed a safe haven at the end of the day, and, most of all, because not even the most pessimistic of souls could imagine what was to come. Some Austrian Jews, of course, did sense it was time to leave, among them Edith Buxbaum, who fled to New York City in 1937, after the police began threatening her with jail for her left-wing political beliefs. The year before, Fritz Riddle, though not Jewish, also had emigrated to the United States. Not everyone had the connections, or, like the writer Stefan Zweig, the fame, to persuade reluctant governments around the world to grant them visas. But, though Bruno Bettelheim was by no means famous, he did have a connection, a far better one than most Jews in Vienna had. In the summer of 1936, Gina had taken Patsy to the United States for 2.5 months. She spent 6 weeks as a counselor at the camp on Cape Cod that the child attended. The rest of the time she stayed with the Peel family in Connecticut or toured New England with Agnes and Patsy, stopping at elegant inns. Agnes had urged her not to return to Vienna, but she had. Now, as the situation in Austria worsened, Agnes began pleading with her to come back to America for good. Her plan was simple, the kind a willful and wealthy woman could afford to hatch. The Peel family, with its thriving beer business, had more than enough resources to provide a sanctuary for the Bettelheims. Gina and Bruno should bring Patsy home, and Agnes would take care of them all. Bruno could pursue his dream of becoming a teacher, and Gina would become the child's permanent caretaker. Despite the political Templars shaking Austria, the Bettelheims rejected the proposal. Gina had already watched over Patsy for 6 years and had no intention of doing so indefinitely, however much she loved her. She also feared Agnes had ulterior motives. On her summer visit in 1936, she had detected in her hostess what she regarded as lesbian tendencies toward her. For Bruno, there remained his responsibilities as son and brother, and to the lumber business. He also had begun an affair with a young woman named Gertrude Weinfeld. She, too, was a regular visitor to the Sterba waiting room in the mid-1930s. In 1914, when Trude was 3 years old, her father, an officer in the Austrian army, abruptly left home for 5 years, 4 of which he spent as a prisoner of war in Siberia. At about the same time, she was made to watch her brother's son. For a long time thereafter, truths that no amount of comforting could banish. She had sought out Etta the Sterba to try and confront these childhood traumas, which she felt were at least partly responsible for her shyness and repressed sexuality. She had been encouraged to seek therapy by her close friend Emmarina Vischer, the daughter of a Swiss minister who had just married Etta the Sterba's brother, Hubert. Both Trude and Emmarina were in their mid-20s and taught at a 3-room school operated on the Montessori principles, which were then being established throughout Europe. Weinfeld had already taken courses in social work for 2 years, but most jobs were closed to her because she was Jewish. When the opportunity opened at the Montessori school in the mid-1930s, she seized it with enthusiasm. The work was hard but rewarding and exciting, and involved much interaction with the Vienna world of psychoanalysis, including a course on teaching led by Anna Freud herself. Trude and Emmarina also made a trip to Rome, where they met Maria Montessori and visited her original school. Soon Trude was teaching both first and second grades, finding great joy in the Montessori method of treating children as individuals by drawing on their creativity. Many of their pupils were the sons and daughters of Americans, and most of them were emotionally stable. But one was Patsy. Trude Weinfeld met Bruno Bettelheim in the mid-1930s, when he and Gina gave a birthday party for their troubled ward. By now, the Bettelheims' marriage had begun to fray, in part because of the strain in their sexual relationship, which Gina said, without casting blame, was never comfortable. They were sleeping in separate bedrooms. Though she felt a growing desire to have a child of her own, both she and Bruno resisted this because of their shaky partnership. Gina had already had a brief affair with a married doctor and had now fallen in love with another married man. a research associate in the dental department of the University of Vienna named Joseph Weinmann. An oral pathologist whose friends all called him by his middle name, Peter, Weinmann had pursued the kind of serious academic life Bruno had so often envied from behind his desk at the lumberyard. He was Dr. Weinmann, a modest, dedicated scientist whose reputation was such that he had been called in to help treat Sigmund Freud's cancer of the jaw and palate. He was also Patsy's dentist, which is how he and Gina met, and before long he and his wife, Bertel, were exchanging social visits with the Bettelheims. Smoking professional man, and in so many ways his opposite, created an emotional vacuum for Bruno that Trude Weinfeld began to fill. Bruno started to ask Trude out occasionally when Gina was otherwise occupied, to take walks in the Schönbrunn Palace gardens or visit the arcades at the Prater, sometimes with Patsy in tow. Gradually, they grew more daring and went off alone into the Vienna woods, where Bruno sometimes let Trude practice driving his gray Fiat. When Trude had a break from her duties at the Montessori school, she would rush across the Grun and Torgassi to a small store that had a telephone and call Bruno, always at the office, so as not to arouse Gina's suspicions. Still, she continued to visit the Bettelheim apartment, on one occasion to help Gina make up Patsy and other children for the pre-Lenten fashion festivities. When it became quite late, Gina invited her to spend the night in a small bedroom. I couldn't sleep, Trude recalled, and I began to realize that I was in love with Bruno, while Gina was away in the United States. During the summer of 1936, Bruno and Trude spent more and more time together, their affair fraught with guilt. Exciting as it was forbidden. Superscript 1. Though neither the Bettelheims nor the Weinmanns had children of their own, in the beginning neither couple seriously considered divorce, a rare solution to marital dissonance at the time. With both romances agitating beneath the surface, domestic life went on much as usual at Gloria Tagasi 15, which had the appearance of a warm, loving home, one filled with the comfortable modern furniture that Bruno bought or had made by his workmen at the lumberyard. Both he and Gina had sensitive eyes for art, and even before they married had purchased a Kath Kollwitz lithograph of a working woman wearing a black shawl. To this Bruno added, among other paintings and objects, a 1914 Egan Schiele called Vorstadt I, a painting of dark suburban houses on a white field that had been exhibited at the Heigenband Neue Gallery in Vienna in 1928. He did everything so I would love it, Gina told me, recalling that Bruno always made a point of giving her 2 presents at Christmas because her birthday fell on Christmas Eve. He continued to earn a good living in the lumber business, going off each morning to Bettelheim and Schnitzer, returning at noon for the main meal of the day, then taking the tram or driving back to the office at Gaudensdorfer Gürtel 3A, near the Matzleinsdorf freight station. Gina ran the nursery school with Annie Hatchak and on separate occasions as neurotic, and an older, healthy Chinese woman who she said was seriously depressed. Both were patients of Richard Sterba, who asked Gina to house them for short periods and to provide supportive counseling. Often Bruno, Gina, Patsy, and one of these singular guests took the evening meal together, a quartet of disparate psyches served by Hedwig. In 1936, Bettelheim resumed his studies at the University of Vienna, prodded by Trude, who sensed how important a degree would be for him if events did force him to emigrate. He had been deep in the study of the humanities in general, and art history in particular, when his father's death had forced him to quit 10 years before. His great passion was Italian art, a world opened up to him, he would write, by an early reading of Jacob Burckhardt's 1860 masterpiece, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. He said that in the summer of 1922, following his first year at the university, he had traveled to Italy, primarily because of the Swiss historian's writings. Hister Cicerone, Bettelheim wrote of Burckhardt's comprehensive guide to Italian art, was my vademecum. It is not exaggeration to say that for more than a decade it became my Bible. I I tried to make every year at least one, and sometimes two prolonged trips to Italy, the cicerone at all times in my hand. It was this experience that helped me to switch my major from German language and literature to art history, and finally to aesthetics, in which I took my degree. Superscript 1 Bettelheim managed to take 9 courses, while continuing to co-manage the lumber business with Hans Schnitzer. He also began work on his dissertation, Das Problem der Naturskomen und die Moderne Ästhetik, superscript 1 squared in it, he wrote 5 decades later. He tried to integrate a psychoanalytically informed approach to the psychology of art with a philosophical understanding of beauty and with the history of art. Superscript 1 cubed the dissertation does take the Kantian view that it is the mark of a good soul to take an unmediated interest in the beauty of nature. But the claim that the work was psychoanalytically informed is overstated. Essentially, Bettelheim argued that the aesthetics of nature were not sufficiently appreciated compared with the aesthetics of art. This was so for both historical and systematic reasons. Historical because the
history of art is older than aesthetics, and therefore what is really an art historical evaluation gets confused with an aesthetic one. Systematic because a work of art is much easier. Bettelheim saw the aesthetic experience thing, with the latter representing the outer world. Here he used the German word aushoben, a Hegelian term notoriously difficult to translate. It combines two meanings, to postpone, or keep for later, and to lift up, or make non-existent for the moment. When one is experiencing such a relationship with nature, Bettelheim wrote, thinking and will are switched off in the aesthetic experience. The significance of one's own personality is erased, and there is no division between the inner and the outer world. In order for such a melting together to happen, the aesthetic object must represent the existential world, a real view of a landscape rather than a framed rendering, which puts it one step removed. Bettelheim maintained that the aesthetic experience of nature makes greater demands on the psyche than does a work of art, because the viewer experiences the object, the Vienna woods or a bend in the Danube, without the mediation of the artist. In his conclusion, he wrote that people who do intellectually demanding work seek out the aesthetic experience of nature because they need it for the harmony of their psyches. Only in nature, he said, are we freed from the requirement to think. In literature we must think about the words, in the fine arts about what is represented. Music comes closest to nature, in requiring only an emotional response. In an aesthetic experience of nature, we feel the world rather than think it. Bettelheim's thesis examiners were Robert Reininger, a Kant scholar, and Carl P.V.H.L., by then a well-known psychologist who, with his wife, Charlotte, ran a psychological institute in Vienna. Bettelheim told his son that the two examiners made him rewrite his dissertation several times, urging him to sharpen the focus by shortening each version. He regarded their instructions as one of his most important writing lessons, and although his future manuscripts would often prove repetitive and overwritten, the dissertation experience helped make him eager for good editing all his life. Superscript 1 for the thesis ran 145 double-spaced typewritten pages. Reininger graded it very good. EVHL found it excellent. On May 31, 1937, the university approved the work, and on February 2 of the following year awarded Bettelheim a degree in philosophy, which signified his general study of the humanities. Superscript 1 5 Bettelheim's academic record shows that he took 3 courses in general psychology. 2 just before his father's death forced him to leave the university in 1926, and 1 in the winter of 1936-37. Superscript 1 6 all were taught by Carl P.V.H.L., who in 1918 had published Die Geistige Entwicklung des Kindes, the mental development of the developmental psychology of the child, the Center of Child Study in Austria. Fritz Rettel also studied with B.V.H.L. at the university. Bettelheim would eventually say that, like his friend, he had been in training analysis with Richard Sturb. He made it clear that these sessions were interrupted by the Anschluss, but in the tale he told many times about applying as a candidate for the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute, he said he had had the stamp of approval of the master himself. Bettelheim would eventually say that, like his friend, he had been in training analysis with Richard Sturb. He made it clear that these sessions were interrupted by the Anschluss, but in the tale he told many times about applying as a candidate for the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute, he said he had had the stamp of approval of the master himself. He said he was interviewed by 3 people: Paul Federn, the psychoanalyst and member of Freud's inner circle, Anna Freud, and a person he could no longer remember. Bettelheim told one enthralled audience that, when he was interviewed by Anna Freud, it happened that her father entered the room in which we were talking. She introduced me to him and he was very gracious and said a few words, which was a lot because he already had cancer of the jaw, which made speaking very difficult and very painful. At the end he asked me what my background was, in which field I had taken my Ph.D. and I told him that I had come originally from the study of literature, then to the study of art history and philosophy, and I finally had taken my doctor's degree in aesthetics. To which Sigmund Freud said, "This is exactly the person we need for psychoanalysis to grow and develop. We need people with a broad humanistic background much more than we need people with a medical background." Superscript 17 In another version of this encounter, Bettelheim said that, when Anna introduced him to her father, Sigmund declared, "Bettelheim does not need any introduction to me." He explained that Freud, as a student, frequently came to the house of my grandfather, and he became friendly with an uncle of mine who shared military service with him. Superscript 18 If this meeting did take place, Bettelheim never reported the happy appointment to Gina, nor do records at the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute offer any evidence that Bettelheim was ever in training analysis with Richard Sturb or anyone else, or that he was a candidate for the society, even briefly. On February 11th, 9 days after Bettelheim received his diploma from the University of Vienna, Dr. von Schuschnigg left the capital by special train for a secret meeting with Adolf Hitler. Schuschnigg, the Jesuit intellectual, had presided over Austria's clerical fascist state since becoming chancellor after Adolphus' assassination in the summer of 1934. Now he had been summoned by the super-fascist to his eagle's nest in the Bavarian mountains at Berchtesgaden. The next day, between lunch and boasts about the huge skyscrapers he planned to build in the Third Reich and strolls past the picture window that looked down into Austria, the FDHR advised Schuschnigg that he was stand in his way by hands a 2-page typewritten set of demands that Hitler said must be signed on the spot if the Austrian lead, PR, wanted to avoid an invasion by the German army. In effect, he had been told to hand over his government to the Nazis within a week. After some inconsequential modifications, Schuschnigg signed and retreated down the mountain. Superscript 1 Within 4 days, Schuschnigg lifted the ban on the Nazi Party, whose hooligans had been seething just beneath the surface of Austrian political life for months, and granted a general amnesty to the party's jailed members, including those who had murdered Adolphus. At Hitler's insistence, Schuschnigg named the pro-Nazi Viennese lawyer Arthur Seyss in court Minister of the Interior, with control over security and the police. On February 28, the ecstatic FDHR addressed the Reichstag in Berlin and made it plain that the future of Austria's 7 million citizens as well as 3 million Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia was now in his hands. The fiery speech was broadcast throughout Austria and set off Nazi demonstrations from Vienna to the Tyrol. In the Alpine provinces, wrote Paul Hoffman, Nazis took over the schools, many government offices, and the army and police barracks. Swastika banners were seen everywhere, and jubilant crowds were parading. In Vienna, hundreds and then thousands surged into the streets, shouting "Heil Hitler!" and "One people, one Reich, one theater." The police no longer interfered. Superscript 2 degrees. The hapless Schuschnigg tried to answer the FDHR in a speech of his own to the Austrian Bundestag on February 24th. In impassioned words, he told the cheering deputies that the country was determined to remain independent. Summoning the colors of the Austrian flag, he concluded, "Until death. Red, white, red." This speech, too, was broadcast to the Austrian people. In Graz, 90 miles south of Vienna, the mob of some 20,000 Nazis took over the town square, tore down the loudspeakers and the Austrian flag, and ran up the swastika. Schuschnigg, now desperate, contacted the underground leaders of the outlawed Social Democrats, whose workers his Christian socialists had been shooting at 4 years. He promised to legalize the party again. It promised to join him in opposing the Nazis. On March 9th, Shushnaji astonished almost everyone by announcing a plebiscite for the following Sunday, March 13th, in which Austrians, or at least those allowed to vote in a country that had permitted no re-elections for 5 years, would decide on independence. William L. Shirer was an American radio correspondent. I emerged from the subway to the Karlsplatz. Before I knew it, I was being swept along in a shouting, hysterical Nazi mob. The faces. I had seen these before at Nuremberg, the fanatical eyes, the gaping mouths. What had happened? I was still in the dark. I shouted my question into the ears of 3 or 4 jammed against me. No response. Couldn't hear. Finally, the middle-aged woman seemed to get me. The plebiscite. She yelled. Called off a superscript to superscript 1, and enraged Hitler had ordered the referendum cancelled. When Shushnaji acquiesced, his tormentor and demanded that the beleaguered chancellor leave office, which he promptly did on March 13th, ending his resignation broadcast, God Save Austria. Within 4 hours, German troops invaded the country at Salzburg, Kufstein, and Mittenwald, and the Horst Wessel song rang over the airwaves from Vienna for the first time. The next day, Hitler made his triumphal entry into the city. I'll never forget the noise of those boots on the street, recalled Trude Weinfeld. Superscript to the largest crowd in the city's history, estimated at upward of 500,000 people, crushed into the Heldenplatz, the vast heroes' square. In front of the Hofburg, Hitler addressed his frenzied appearance from the balcony of the former imperial residence, declaring, as FDA Charter and Chancellor of the German nation, I report now, before history, the entry of my native land into the German Reich. Superscript to superscript 3 over the weekend. An orgy of sadism began in Vienna that Shirer said was worse than anything he had witnessed in Germany itself up to that point. The Luftwaffe sent low-flying aircraft over the city to terrorize the population, while Nazi bully boys in swastika armbands roamed the streets, assaulting Jews and forcing them to scrub the gutters on their knees, sometimes with toothbrushes. The police began arresting hundreds of monarchists, socialists, labor leaders, and others, among them the banker Baron Louis D. Rothschild and Otto Levy, who 2 years before had been a co-recipient of the Nobel Prize for Medicine. Many found themselves incarcerated in the vast hotel metropole, which overnight had become Gestapo headquarters, with many rooms converted into holding cells. Throughout the city, the new rulers began the systematic plunder of Jewish businesses and homes. Suicides, always high in Austria, rose dramatically. On March 16th, Emil Faith, Vice-Chancellor under Dollfuss and a prominent leader of the Heimwehr, shot his wife, his son, and him into an other place, Edward R. Shirer, after they entered a quiet bar off the Kartnerstrasse. Perplexed, Shirer asked why. I was here last night about this time, Bruno said. The Jewish-looking fellow was standing at that bar. After a while he took an old-fashioned razor from his pocket and slashed his throat. Superscript to for one journal reported that, in the first year of Nazi rule, 3,741 Austrian Jews killed themselves. Superscript to 5 almost all were Viennese, among them Trude Weinfeld's hand. Though Bruno Bettelheim would write thousands of words on the Holocaust, his books and articles tell us virtually nothing about how he reacted to the Anschluss, or to the events leading up to and following that cataclysmic weekend. He did, however, talk about his behavior and describe it in letters. At the orthogenic school, he told stories of his activities in the Austrian underground, of how he sometimes hid out at night while working with the resistance. He was very down on the BSG certain boys had in toy guns, recalled Ronald Van Grace, a resident of the school in the 1960s. He would talk about how guns foster violence and then say, even when I was in the underground, I never carried a gun, because I feared I might be tempted to use it. Bettelheim told the author James T. Farrell, with whom he corresponded on and off throughout much of his life in the United States, that he stood watch at a Vienna gas works that he and his socialist compatriots expected the fascists to blow up. He wrote that the attack never materialized and that the Sentinels finally abandoned their post after burying their weapons. He then walked 10 miles home. Superscript to 6 Bettelheim told an interviewer that his primary role in the underground was to supply money and false papers to Austrians seeking to escape the Nazis. Superscript to 7 later. He would tell a colleague that he had been an officer in the underground army and that he had remained in Austria long enough to demobilize his men before escaping to Czechoslovakia, where he was detained until the Nazis arrested him. Superscript to 8 in recounting such stories. Bettelheim was sometimes explicitly critical of Jews who had not joined the resistance, telling his young charges at the school that more Jews should have acted as he had, and drawing the parallel between himself and the hero of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's autobiographical novel, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisov. In 1945, in a sworn affidavit solicited for use in the Nuremberg war crimes trials, Bettelheim told yet another story of his attempted escape. About March 12, 1938, he said, "It became apparent to me that I would not be permitted to live in peace enough to leave the country. My wife and I stopped at the Czechoslovakian-Hungarian border that night." He implied that they were seeking to flee by car, for he said that the next day they tried to leave Vienna by train. He said that this time Gina Bettelheim was permitted to proceed but that he was detained by the police, who confiscated his passport. Bettelheim did not say where he and Gina hoped to go if they had gotten across the border by car, or where his wife did go when officials allowed her to board the train. Nor did he mention Patsy. Superscript to records at the archive of the Austrian resistance provide no evidence Bettelheim played any role in the underground, and Gina told me that he did not. Bruno was not interested in politics, she said. Of course we were upset by the advent of Dollfuss in 1933 and the rise of Nazism thereafter. But we were not active politically. She said that even when her husband talked of emigrating to the United States, it was less because of Hitler's shadow than because he was frustrated in the lumber business and yearned more than ever for an academic career, which might be available to him in America, especially if he managed to get a university degree. As for their actions on that mid-March weekend when the unleashed Austrian Nazis rampaged through Vienna streets, Gina gave the following version of events. That Sunday evening, Peter and Berta Weinman came to dine at the Bettelheim apartment. Afterward, Gina and Bruno drove them home and en route saw hundreds of their Gentile countrymen in the streets, rejoicing over Austria's infant in the Third Reich. The Weinmans had been prepared to leave for England if Hitler came, and now they decided to go. Bruno said to me, "You have to leave with Patsy. I can manage more easily by myself." "You go with Peter and Berta?" Gina had already told Patsy's mother that if the Nazi threat reached a crisis point she would leave everything and bring the child to the United States. On Monday morning, Gina again spoke by phone with Aunt Miss. As she had been urging for months, Patsy's mother said yes, of course Gina should come, and as soon as possible. Bruno should come, too, and neither of them should even think about ever going back. Ordinarily, Gina would have had as much trouble getting away as the thousands of other Jews who were now clamoring for visas of escape, but 3 weeks before the Anschluss, Agnes had managed to gain the attention of Cordell Hull, the U.S. Secretary of State, on behalf of her daughter and Gina. In a letter to the American consul in Vienna, a copy of which went to Hull, she wrote, "In view of current political developments in Austria, Mrs. Bettelheim, who is Jewish, may have need of your help in bringing my child to a place of safety. In any emergency, my daughter should be set for virtually the mother to her and on whom she has a child's emotional dependence. The need for Mrs. Bettelheim's continued nearness to and care of my child is, however, even more pressing than the above statement implies." 6 years ago, upon the advice of a Viennese psychiatrist, to whom I had brought my child for treatment when specialists in this country had said that her condition was hopeless, I put her in the care of Mrs. Bettelheim. During these 6 years my child's condition has steadily improved until now it seems that she may grow up to live a normal life. A prime factor in this improvement has been the work of Mrs. Bettelheim, who is a trained worker with problem children. I have been warned by 2 psychiatrists that any emotional shock such as would result from her sudden separation from Mrs. Bettelheim might well undo the work of the past 6 years and make her a permanent mental invalid. Superscript 3 degrees. On March 12th, the consulate granted Gina a 6-month visitor's visa. Superscript 3 Superscript 1 Her plan was to take Patsy first to Paris, along with the wine man's. Her marriage was broken. She was traveling with her lover and his wife, but all that seemed secondary as she said goodbye to Bruno, whom she had known for 17 years, 8 of them as his wife, and who, whatever the strains in their relationship, always had treated her with generosity and kindness. As they parted at the Westbahnhof, where the ragged Adolf Hitler had once made a few coins lugging suitcases, both feared that they never would see one another again. The train left at midnight, Patricia Lynn recalled, and I tried to sleep by sitting up and hiding behind a coach. Superscript 3 Superscript 2 The next day, as they rolled toward France, young Nazi inspectors came through the carriages checking passports, papers, and the amounts of money passengers had taken with them. Gina, fearful that they would discover she was taking more out of Austria than regulations permitted, went to the lavatory and flushed away most of the cash she was carrying. She and Patsy did not share a compartment with the wine man's, and when Gina went in search of them in the morning they were not on the train. One of Peter's dental assistants, a Nazi sympathizer, had reported him, and he and his wife had been detained in Vienna. But they managed to board a later train and arrived in Paris only a few hours after Gina and Patsy. All of them stayed with Marina Visscher, who, with her husband, Hubert Radinoich Hartmann, was now living in Paris and providing temporary quarters for an increasing stream of refugee friends and friends of friends. On March 17th, Gina and Patsy sailed from Miami docked in New York Harbor 9 days to know Bettelheim's compulsion to exaggerate the facts with tales of BS to the border and adventures in the Austrian underground embellished behavior that, if left unvarnished, would seem altogether worthy, and, in the catastrophe of the Anschluss, selfless. He might well have been able to obtain a visitor visa along with Gina, given that Patsy had lived with both of them for 7 years and that Agnes was offering refuge to him as well as to his wife. But he chose to stay in Vienna at that critical moment, in part because he felt he could not walk away from Bettelheim and Schnitzer, but primarily because he would not abandon his mother and sister. When he discussed the possibility of emigrating in the days after the Nazi maelstrom began sucking at Vienna's Jews, Margaret grew hysterical and begged him not to leave. Superscript 3 For a number of years, his sister had pursued a career as an actress, studying in Germany and on a few occasions performing at provincial theaters there and at Vienna's Deutsches Vorkast-Theater. A publicity photograph shows her in the white toga she wore as Iphigenie, a handsome but somber-looking woman with dark, soulful eyes and brown, wavy hair who used the stage name Margaret Roeder. Her career was middling at best, and by the end of the 1930s she was dabbling in journalism for the Vienna Daily Der Morgen, and often seen with its editor-in-chief. She was still living at home with her mother, not a typical arrangement for a woman nearing 40. While her younger brother supported the household by working at a job he disliked, she led the life of a dilettante, hobnobbing with Vienna's newspaper crowd at the Café Herrenhof into the small hours and sleeping until noon. Gina Bettelheim found her sister-in-law arrogant and judgmental, in part because Margaret made plain her disapproval of what she regarded as the grand life her brother and Gina led at Gloria Tegese 15. In Gina's view, Marge Gaddett was jealous of her brother, who had always been poor Bettelheim's father child. What Bruno himself thought of his sister at this stage he never set down on the page. As with his other relatives, even including his parents, he did not even give her name on the few occasions when he mentioned her. In the days following the Anschluss, Nazi predations in Vienna grew more and more terrifying. Now that the annexation was a fait accompli, Hitler resurrected the plebiscite in a whirlwind of pro-Reich propaganda. While Jews by the thousands continued to scrub streets and latrines, the Viennese Archbishop, Cardinal Theodor Nitzer, fell into goose step with the new regime. He had welcomed the FDA charter with the Nazi salute on March 14th, Now he instructed his Catholic flock that it was their national duty to vote the country into GR. Many, on an official tally of more than 99%, went not forced into the streets to do the Nazis' bidding. They continued their frantic efforts to obtain visas B, for the knock came at their doors. One lived in a state of permanent anxiety, recalled Maria Thiers, during this post-Anschluss period. She encountered Bruno at a social gathering and he told her he planned to take a vacation at some resort town and swim the Rhine to safety. The feat that would require his first making it to the eastern shore of the river, where it flows between Austria and Switzerland, or traveling to Germany itself and swimming to France. It was also naive. We were incredibly stupid, Thiers said. By April 28, 10 days after Hitler rubber-stamped plebiscite, Bettelheim had begun to focus seriously on trying to leave his homeland. On that day, he went to the consulate and, like hundreds of other Viennese Jews, applied for a visa as a quota immigrant to the United States. He told Don Italy, the vice consul who typed up his application, that he intended to settle permanently in America and that he would pay for his own passage. He had not arranged it yet, but said that when he did sail he planned to join Mrs. Agnes P. Crane in Greenwich, Connecticut, where Patsy's mother now lived with her new husband, Percy Hatfield Crane. She had already sent the required affidavit for Bruno on April 8 and had been assured by John C. Wiley, the American consul in Vienna, that all was in order. But Medley told the desperate applicant that the affidavit was not in his file. Moreover, he said Bettelheim should not return to the consulate until it had received word from the U.S. Department of Labor that Gina had acquired an immigration visa. As opposed to the 6-month visitor document she had been granted to accompany Patsy across the Atlantic. Superscript 3.5 This now became the principal sticking point, as Agnes Crane plunged into the State Department labyrinth with growing dismay and frustration. In mid-May, hoping that her efforts at last might have produced results, she blabbed Bettelheim, urging him to return to the consulate. He went immediately, he replied, but to no avail. The consular officials told him Crane's affidavit was not in his file and refused to look for it. I was told that it would be superfluous to search, since my case is considered closed, he told his sponsor. Superscript 3.6 Somehow, Agnes Crane succeeded in keeping Cordell Hull at least marginally interested in helping her. A remarkable achievement given that the Secretary of State had a good deal else on his mind as Hitler threatened to devour Europe and the Japanese expanded into Asia. On May 28, he cabled Vienna seeking a status report on the Bettelheim visa app. John C. Wiley, back S up, Port F for Bettelheim, believed inadequate because apparently contingent on wife's permanent entry into the United States. In the days that followed, Crane received a maddening recommendation from A.M. Warren, chief of the State Department's Visa Division. He said that the only way Gina could obtain an immigration visa was to leave the sanctuary she had just found. She need not return to Vienna, Warren told Crane, and suggested that Gina try the consulate in Cuba and that Bruno could join her there, after which they could apply together for entry as quota immigrants. Warren did not speculate on how long this process might take, or discuss whether Cuba would prove any more sympathetic to Bettelheim's plight than the United States. On May 31st, Wiley sent another communique to Hull there, after which they could apply together for entry as quota immigrants. Warren did not speculate on how long this process might take, or discuss whether Cuba would prove any more sympathetic to Bettelheim's plight than the United States. On May 31st, Wiley sent another communique to Hull, this time outlining the bureaucratic obstacles that prevented the consulate from issuing a visa to Bettelheim. He said he appreciated the inconvenience caused the American citizens interested in this case, as well as the inconvenience caused the applicant and his wife. Superscript 3.7 2 days later, Bettelheim was on a train for Dachau.